Hi everyone, welcome to your lesson on oceans. And as we get more into cycle 2, our theme is movement. We are going to be exploring the movement of gases through the water. We're going to be exploring the movement of air through the water, the movement of wind, and how that affects the different patterns that occur across Earth with water. So before we get into that, we're going to go over a review of water on Earth. So how much of it and where. So you guys did a really cool lab on properties of water, and before that we watched the National Geographic video clip, the one that we used in seminar, and we learned that 98% of water on Earth is salt water, and 2% is fresh water. So of the 2% of fresh water that is on Earth, 87% of that is locked up in ice caps. So that means it's not usable for us. 12% of it is in groundwater, and about 1% of it is in rivers and lakes. So that's very, very, very little fresh water available for human consumption. So this lesson is going to focus on the water that is not available for human consumption, the salty water. And we're going to get into why the ocean is salty, what makes it salty. So the ocean's salty because of dissolved chemicals that have eroded over time, so that have worn away from the Earth's crust and washed out into the sea. And those chemicals that have washed out into the sea are salty. The ocean is also salty because of solid and gas ejections from volcanoes. So things that have spewed out of volcanoes, and the suspended particles have swept into the ocean from the land by winds. So volcano erupts, particles fall on the land, the wind blows it into the ocean, and those materials are deposited on the floor of the ocean, and that has also led to an increase of salinity levels in the ocean. Salinity is another way of saying salt. So what affects ocean salinity? So the ocean there's different levels of salt in different parts of the ocean, and we want to find out why. So salinity in ocean waters is increased by evaporation. So when water evaporates off the surface of the ocean, that leaves less water back behind, and the salt does not evaporate up with the water, and so that leaves more salt in the ocean. Salinity is also increased by the freezing of sea ice and is decreased as a result of rainfall. So when you have rain, fresh water, that mixes with the salt water, or when you have melting of ice, which is fresh water, mixing with salt water, it's going to make it less salty. The average salinity of seawater is 35 parts per 1,000. Now again, I just said that it's not the same across the whole ocean, but the average, that's how salty it is on average. And salinities are much less than average in the polar areas, or in the polar seas, and near the mouths of large rivers. And think about that for a minute. Why would it be less salty in polar seas? Polar meaning the areas near the poles, where it's really, really cold. What do the poles have that would make it be less salty? And why near the mouth of a large river would it be less salty? Think about that. Okay, so the reason is because the ice, where you have polar seas, where you have really cold, you have the freezing of sea ice, and you also have ice melting in those areas right now because of warmer temperatures. And when you have ice that is melting, you have fresh water melting, making it less salty. And then the mouths of large rivers, you have fresh water mixing with salt water. So it's going to be less. So Those areas where you have fresh water mixing with salt water are called estuaries. And you guys are going to do a really cool activity with estuaries where you're going to look at different latitudes and longitudes, different locations on Earth, to look at where estuaries are located and what kinds of habitats estuaries are, and what kinds of different organisms live in estuaries and different plants grow. So estuaries, again, are areas where you have fresh water mixing with salt water, so where rivers dump out into the ocean. And what happens when you have this is you have different variations in salinity. So it's not the same saltiness as the rest of the ocean. You have very high biological activity. There's lots of different life forms in estuaries, and these are one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth because of this very, very specific mix of salt and fresh water. So many different things thrive in that environment. Estuaries trap nutrients and sediments that are carried from the land by rivers and from the ocean by tides. So we have the ocean coming in one side with the tides, and we have the river coming from the other side. And where they meet, there's this amazing mix of nutrients. And these nutrients are constantly being mixed because the waves never stop. So there's tidal action, and the river doesn't stop flowing. So there's river flow, and that creates a really fertile ground for plant and animal life. And remember, when you're taking notes on all of these, to really listen to what the video is saying and then pause it, put it in your own words. Don't feel like you have to copy down every single one of these words. Here's a great diagram of an estuary. So at the top left, you have the river, and it is dumping out into the ocean. And up at the top, you see an arrow goes from fresh to salt. The very middle there is brackish. So when you have a mixture of fresh water and salt water, that's called brackish water. And that's what makes estuaries so special, and where the life really thrives. So your eighth end of the year trip to Edisto Island, South Carolina, guess what? There is an estuary that we can hike to. And here is a sneak peek of the amazing 8th grade end of the year experience. All right, back to estuaries. So because estuarine waters are shallow, estuaries are very shallow. In North Carolina, they are less than 30 feet deep. And because of this, sunlight will go all the way to the bottom. This really helps plants grow all the way at the bottom of estuaries. So these conditions create unique habitats for both plants and animals and provide the basis for tons of biological diversity. So there's lots of different species of fish, shrimp, crabs, clams, oysters, and all of these different species are able to adapt to the brackish or salty conditions. Estuaries are really good nurseries because they provide a protected environment for species to hatch and grow in before they have to migrate out to sea and live out their adult lives. So lots of different species of organisms will use estuaries as a place to have babies, and their babies are often kept pretty safe in estuaries compared to out in the open sea. This is the coast of North Carolina, and you can just see how many estuaries. If you can see the three big ones, the Albemarle Sound and the Pamlico Sound, but anywhere else you see a river dumping out into the ocean, that's an estuary where you have this great mix of fresh and salt water. So, last couple things on estuaries is they help control erosion and reduce flooding on the mainland. The sandbars buffer the impact of waves, so it makes the impact of waves less. And then you have plants and shellfish beds that anchor the shore against the tides. And in addition, estuaries also serve as a type of environmental filter. Plants and animals in the estuaries actually filter pollutants out of the water. So oysters can filter impurities out of water as they eat, and they actually collect contaminants in their bodies one oyster in one day can actually filter 25 gallons of water. So think about that before you eat oysters, how many gallons of water it has filtered and what possible contaminants they might have in their bodies. Did your oysters come from clean water? If the answer is no, you might not want to eat them. So bacteria eat organic matter found in the sediment and then in turn release carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfate, and methane into the atmosphere and prevent these gases from being excessively stored up in the estuary. Chemical pollution and sedimentation are big threats to the well-being of estuaries and oceans. And as we just learned, estuaries are incredibly important. They're an incredibly important part of hydrology, and they play a role in so many different things. So it's really important to help to keep estuaries healthy. All right, so the last part of our lesson is on the ocean and climate. So oceans collect, move, and mix. Three important things. They collect, move, and mix water, heat, and the gas carbon dioxide. So the ocean can hold and circulate more water, heat, and carbon dioxide than the atmosphere can. So because the ocean can store up so much heat, seasons occur later than they would, and air above the ocean is warmed. Heat energy stored in the ocean in one season will affect the climate almost an entire season later. So the ocean stores up heat. The stored up heat in the ocean is not used to affect the climate until an entire season later. And air temperatures, as a result of all of the heat in the ocean that's stored, air temperatures all over the world are regulated and entirely dependent on the circulation of the heat by the oceans. So when water evaporates, evaporation cools the ocean water, which then in turn cools the atmosphere. And that's most noticeable near the equator. And then the effect decreases closer to the poles. And that's because it's warmest around the equator. So you'll notice it cooling. You'll notice a more drastic difference between hot and cold. Whereas up near the poles, it's colder. So when something cools off, it really doesn't seem like it's cooling because it's already cold. So winds are a really important force in creating ocean currents and for moving those three things, in addition to animals and plants. So under certain conditions, upwelling can occur. So upwelling is really important. Upwelling is a good thing, first of all. And upwelling is when you have the warm surface water near the coast, when it's blown aside by wind. So the water on the top is blown aside, and then below it, water rises to take its place. And normally, and this is cold water that rises to take its place. Normally, cold things don't rise because they're more dense, but water moves to fill the container that it's in. So when the waves push the water aside, water is going to rise up to take its place because it's filling the place that the water moved. And with it, it's going to carry all sorts of goodness, good sediments, good organic materials to the surface. And those sediments and organic materials are going to attract fish. So areas of upwelling tend to become areas of really rich biological activity and provide resources to a great diversity of ocean organisms. Approximately half of all the fish caught in the whole world come from areas where there's upwelling. So upwelling is water, cold water that rises up and brings really good nutrients with it. Those really good nutrients attract fish, and you have very high diversity of ocean organisms in these areas because there's lots of food. So oceans and gases. So seawater also has many different gases dissolved in it, especially nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. And the main thing here to keep in mind is that the action of the ocean wind and the waves shakes up or agitates the ocean surface so much, and what that does is that stimulates the exchange of these gases between the ocean and the atmosphere. So the ocean moves not only heat and not only organisms and water around, but it also moves gases between the water and the atmosphere. And marine plants depend on the gases that are dissolved in the water. So the dissolved carbon dioxide, that's used in photosynthesis. Photosynthesis in return releases oxygen into the water, which is used for the organisms to breathe and for respiration. That in turn releases energy for stored carbohydrates and produces carbon dioxide and water as byproducts, and the cycle continues. So, some of the properties of seawater which affect how much gases can be dissolved in it are its temperature, its salinity, and its depth. So temperature, cold water holds more gas than warm water does. Seawater with low salt levels hold more gas than high salt water does. High salinity. And then deeper water, because it has higher pressure, it will hold more gas than shallow water. So in summary, water that's really cold, water that is not as salty, and water that is deeper can hold the most gas. All right, I know that was a lot. You guys are going to be practicing. You're going to be practicing what you just learned in some ocean stations a little bit later on in the cycle. And we will review and show you a little short video on upwelling so that you can see what upwelling is. And we will really tie this into our cycle on movement and see how the ocean moves important things around the earth. Have an awesome day, everybody.